Now let's move on to type declarations. Now there's a few different categories of type declarations in XML schema, some of which we use in the NIEM and one of which we don't really. First, there's complex types with complex content. That's a long phrase for these are containers that hold other elements, and there's a boatload of these in the NIEM. So you see these all the time, and when you extend the NIEM, you'll create some of your own. Then there are complex types with simple content. Now these are not containers for other elements. These contain data, but they also have attributes. So it's more than just data. It's data plus attributes, but not additional elements inside. That's complex type with simple content. Then there's simple types with simple content. And these are types that just hold data. They just hold a string, they just hold a number, or something along those lines. Now you'll see a little asterisk at the end of the bullet there, and there's a reason for that. The NIEM really doesn't use any simple types with simple content. Remember when we were looking at namespaces and we were looking at the abstraction layers, and one of them was called proxy? Well, what proxy does is bolt on some NIEM infrastructure to simple types. Basically, proxy converts simple XML schema types into complex types with simple content. So the NIEM itself doesn't contain any simple types. It contains complex types with simple content that were simple types in XML schema, but we've bolted on some NIEM infrastructure pieces. There are also ways to define types so that they can hold both other elements and data. Now, frankly, it gets kind of confusing when you do that, and the NIEM doesn't use that. It's called mixed content. You won't see that in the NIEM, and in fact, it's forbidden in the NIEM. So you'll never see a type that can contain both elements and data. You won't see it in the NIEM. So we're not going to cover it. It's out there. You can use it in other XML work, but you can't use it in the NIEM. So those are our three types, and really the NIEM only uses two. We have complex types with complex content, which are containers. I like to call them containers. And then there's complex types with simple content, which in the NIEM are how we take care of simple types while still adding NIEM-style infrastructure pieces as attributes. So those are the main kinds of type declarations in the NIEM. Let's take a look at a complex type with complex content, basically a container in the NIEM. And first off, my apologies for there being so much text on the screen. There's really, without taking a whole bunch of stuff out, there's not much we can do about that, but to try to keep it somewhat legible. In this case, this is something we've pulled directly out of the CIFS domain. And you'll see at the top, it's well, first of all, you'll see its XML schema. It's the same XML schema you saw in the previous section when we were introducing it. It starts with the name of the type, the complex type, and its placement type. So so we'll have elements. You'll see at the bottom, we declare an element that's of this placement type. We have a little documentation that gives the definition for it, and then we've got a little bit of app info stuff that talks about the base it's from. Now, that's information for potential tools to use. A tool could read through this and get information about what it's based on from there. But parsers aren't going to care. That's information for other tools. Then we get down after the annotation section, which is all documentation, we get to the start of the complex content. And this is where we start to say what's actually in this placement type. Then we say we're extending, and we say the base we're extending from. In this case, it's activity type. And you'll see the prefix there. Remember, we just got done talking about namespaces. You see the NC colon. That means NIEM core. This is the NIEM core's activity type. This is a plain generic activity that has really kind of general activity-ish sort of things in it. And what we're doing here is we're creating a new container type that extends activity type, which means it's going to inherit generic activity things. And we're going to talk more about inheritance a little later on. Everything's kind of interwoven here. But to that generic activity, it adds some placement-specific stuff. And so after the extension tag, you'll see the sequence tag, and after that, a list of elements that get added to the new type. So the new placement type has all these activity things in it, plus CIFS placement-specific things like a placement category, restrictiveness text, relative home studies text. You can read down the whole thing, ends down with placement category. So that's what forms our new placement type in the CIFS domain. It's based off of an existing type, activity type in NIEM core, and it adds some new elements of our own to it. And then you'll see the sequence closes off, the extension closes off, complex content closes off, and the complex type closes off. And there we have the definition of a placement type, a data type for the placement history of a child or youth. And then way at the bottom of the slide, we have an element of that type. And so that's the actual tag, the actual element that we would use in an instance document. we would have a placement element. And how do we know what goes into a placement element? Well, we look at its type, placement type. We find placement type in the schema, and that's where we see all the things that can go inside of a placement object. And that is a prime example of a complex type with complex content. Now, maybe you're thinking, wait a minute, what if we're not going to extend from anything else? What if we're going to create just a blank container from scratch? And in that case, there is a base that the NIEM supplies, and it's called complex object type, and it's kind of a blank container. Why do you need that complex object type? Well, just like we use the proxy namespace to add infrastructure pieces to plain old data types, we use complex object type to start out with an empty container that has those infrastructure pieces. And we'll hear more about complex object type. You'll see it in the NIEM anytime it's a container that's starting from scratch, but you'll use it yourself when you're extending the NIEM. But there's a whole section on extending the NIEM coming up in a later section, so hang tight for that. Now here's a complex type with simple content. Again, a complex type with simple content holds data rather than other elements, but it also has attributes. Now, in this case, we're looking at text type, and you will see text type all over in the NIEM. Basically, anytime there's a string, it'll be of text type. So here's text type, and it's got the little annotation section with documentation for it. But instead of complex content, it holds simple content. And in this case, it extends from a base of NIEM XSD string, so it's the XML schema's string type filtered through proxy. And in addition to what proxy adds, it adds a language code, a partial indicator to say that whatever text string this is, it's only partial, it's not the whole string, and a truncation indicator to say that it's been truncated. You know, that happens all the time, right? You have a really long name, you punch it into a limited length field, and it gets truncated. So these are kinds of metadata pieces that can go on top of text type to add additional information about the string that text type actually holds. And then below that we see an element declaration, placement category restrictiveness text, which is actually from the previous example. It was one of the elements added to that placement type, and it's of NIEM core text type. The nillable equals true just means that you can set it as nil. It's an XML convention that lets you say we have no data at all for this. Now, you don't use nillable very much, and I'm not going to talk about it much. It's kind of an off topic, just so you know why that's there. But there is the element declaration. It has an annotation section as well with documentation, which is the definition for that particular element. So there's a complex type with simple content. Finally, here's a simple type with simple content. In this case, it's a Boolean. So the name is change of school indicator, and indicator is the word we use in the NIEM for true-false values for Booleans. The type is NIEM-XSD Boolean, so it's XML schema's true-false Boolean type filtered through the proxy namespace to add infrastructure. And really that's all there is to it. There's also the annotation and the documentation that says what the definition is for this particular element. Now you'll notice I said filtered through the proxy namespace because again, there aren't any elements in the NIEM that are actually of simple types. All simple types in the NIEM are filtered through proxy to add NIEM infrastructure attributes to it. So technically, every type in the NIEM that holds data is a complex type with simple content. There are no simple types in the NIEM itself. They're all filtered through proxy and to add the infrastructure pieces. So you won't actually see that. So it's a bit of a misnomer. Conceptually, you can think of them as simple types with simple content in that the only attributes added are infrastructure pieces and not actual NIEM content pieces. But technically, they really are complex types with simple content.